Today I'm going to share with you how I manage my indoors vermiculture system. This is a system that has three basic elements. I use red wiggler worms for composting, and I also ferment the food scraps before I feed them to the worms by using bokashi. Bokashi is essentially a culture that I can add to food scraps to start a process of anaerobic decomposition or fermentation. So essentially I am pickling the food scraps before I feed them to the worms. Stay tuned for another video where I explain step by step how to do the bokashi. It's very simple. But right now I'm going to show you how I set up a worm bin or a vermiculture system using very basics, very cheap materials. So essentially the system has two levels. On one level you have a bucket which I drill holes all over it, including the bottom, on the sides and on the lid. So this is where the worms are going to be. And the second system essentially is just a regular bucket, ideally with fresh wood chips. The purpose of the wood chips is essentially to absorb any moisture that will drip from the worm bin, kind of what they call the worm tea, which usually in the traditional vermiculture bins that you buy, you have like a pivot at the bottom that drains the juice. So here I use wood chips to capture that fertility and really trap it, and then I inoculate the wood chips with King Stropharia, and so far it's done amazing. The King Stropharia really very aggressively colonizes all of the wood chips because of the constant essentially the constant influx of nutrients that come from the worm bin upstairs, kind of the second level where a lot of the decomposition is happening. So next I'm going to show you step by step kind of how I set up my composting bins so you can try it at home. But again, it's just essentially two $6 plastic buckets. One of them you want to drill holes, the one in the bottom you don't, because you don't want any fluid to escape the system, especially if you're doing this indoors. And that's it. So stay tuned for that. So here we have the bottom bin with the wood chips. Ideally you want this to be fresh wood chips. These are not really that fresh, but one thing that you notice is that there is some mycelium, some white mycelium, and that is King Stropharia that I used to inoculate the wood chips in the bottom, because it just adds another layer of biology, another biological system that is going to help my compost system stay fresher, avoid any smells, and just in general have greater biodiversity. So on top of the wood chips I add essentially a clean, this is not very clean, but it's an empty worm bin. The way I manage the worm bin is I add a divider. This is just a piece of mesh that I found. You can see that I've been using it. I usually place it in the middle, and then as I add materials are going to keep it in place. The idea of the mesh is that you're able to add food scraps on one side, and you're able to kind of collect the material that is already halfway decomposed to the other side. That has several implications. Number one, it's going to be easier for you to harvest the stuff that is already decomposed. So essentially the finished worm casting manure, you're going to be able to collect it easily because you are not mixing fresh food scraps with the material that is already decomposed. The other benefit of that is that usually when you add fresh wood scraps, or even if they have been fermented through bokashi, they tend to heat up a little bit right at the beginning. So if the worm bin gets too hot, the worms are going to try to escape. They're going to start trying to find ways to get out of the system because it's too hot. So having two separate sections, one that has fresh kitchen waste or fermented, and the other one that has material that has already gone through that heating process, that is well under on its way to being decomposed, allows the worms to find cooler spots in the bin. And also because there are wood chips in the bottom, and there are holes in the bottom of this top container. If things in general overheat on top, they can also escape to the bottom. So that way you don't have worms kind of crawling through a space, trying to get out, trying to find a warmer, cooler spot. Worms in general, they tend to like cooler temperatures. I notice they do better in winter. This is an attic, the space where I keep them in my house, and usually winter months, when it's like 30 degrees, 20 degrees outside, is when they tend to do best. Now, the stuff doesn't freeze, but there's also not any extra source of heating up here. Is the attic, is usually a divider door. So whatever heat rises from the house, that's what keeps them warm. And also because it's an attic, it tends to heat up during the day. Which is important because as it gets warmer and warmer and spring starts to come in, that's a time when I have to move the worms outside, out of this space, because it will become too hot. Probably by May, it already starts, the temperatures start kind of going pretty high for them to be up here. So this is the system. So what I'm going to do next is I am going to add a layer of leaves. Some stick. So essentially the leaves are your brown material, just like you were doing regular compost, but I'm doing it here to kind of create a foundation a bit. And next, I'm going to start adding the food scraps. So this is the bokashi. So essentially it's a 5-gallon bucket, just like the ones you get at Lowe's or Home Depot. And I've been fermenting food scraps here for the last probably 2 or 3 weeks. So when I open it, you can see that it's quite active. There is mycelia from fungi, which is totally fine because this stuff is going to be eaten out by the worms. Couple of things. So there is a lot of different opinions out there. Some people say that you should not feed your worms bokashi because it's too acidic. Other people say don't put citrus in your worm bin. I have not had any problems putting citrus, onion scraps to my worm bin after it's being cooked through the bokashi. So that is kind of my disclaimer. I use the bokashi for 2 reasons. Number 1, to cook things like that if they are very acidic, if they have citric acid on the peels, that I don't have to worry with the worms being disturbed by that. But also because all of this has been compressed and really sealed tight to get rid of air, a lot of the fluids from the compost have already drained. And I'm going to show you in another video how I do that. But by draining the fluids out of this, I avoid adding more fluid to my bottom compost bin where the wood chips are. So I don't want to have excess. I don't want to have water sitting there. It's okay if it does a little bit, but the wood chips really soak up most of it. But by really kind of getting a lot of the fluids out of the food scrap by fermenting them, I am actually able to keep the bottom bin a lot happier. All right, so stay tuned for the next step. So next, I am going to show you something really important, which is eggshells. So I add eggshells to my composting bins, to the vermiculture system, for a couple of different reasons. I use the eggshells to the calcium in the eggshells to neutralize some of the acidity of the bokashi that I'm going to add into the system. But also eggshells serve the worms very similar to what grits do to chickens. They keep them in their digestive system in order to digest their food. So what worms do is they actually ingest some of the eggshells as grit, and they use it to kind of grind a lot of the stuff that they're ingesting, because in the way they do is they grind it and they soak out all the bacteria that is in the decomposing matter. That's what they're feeding off, on the bacteria. So the eggshells really kind of lend that grit that is important for the worms to digest the food. So this is a food processor. I pay $4 for it at the Salvation Army, so it's a little So the next step is to start adding the food scraps to the system. I usually like to use gloves for this part. After I have added a layer of food scraps, what I do next is I cover them with eggshells. And then on top of the eggshells, I add brown material. Very generously adding a lot of leaves. So this is not different from what you would normally do in a composting system at home or outside. The only difference is you're gonna really accelerate the process through the worms, through the mycelium down there, adding really different layers of biological systems. All right, so I have quite a few leaves there, and then I'm gonna keep adding food scraps. So you can see I add quite a lot of leaves. And I don't try to compact my leaves because I want them to have enough air circulation to keep the compost aerobic so it doesn't go anaerobic. When the compost goes anaerobic, meaning there is no air going in, that's when you're gonna get some of the foul smells. But with this much leaves, you're pretty safe from getting to that point. So normally if I was starting my compost bin for the first time at home, if I just bought some worms, I wouldn't put that much food in it. It would overwhelm the system. But because I know I have enough worms and enough composting material to fill this section to get it really activated, I'm not concerned with the amount of green material that I added to this bin. I usually divide one of those 5-gallon tanks into 2 bins. So let's get to the fun part, which is adding the worms. So my worms are essentially coming from another bin because I've been doing, you see, I keep adding leaves throughout the process. I keep adding layers and layers of leaves because that's what the worms like. I keep it clean, I keep it moist, it keeps things rolling. So I'm gonna add my worms on this side. And I'm gonna top it. I'm gonna actually add some of the compost on this side to help get this side activated. So you see there's worms there. Because we are in the middle of winter, I am not too concerned with this system overheating because the temperatures are pretty extreme right now. It's 30 degrees outside. I don't have any source of heating upstairs, so the temperatures outside of the bins are gonna keep them pretty warm, pretty cool. So even if it gets too hot in the middle, all they have to do is kind of hang out on the periphery, and that will be pretty cool. So I'm not that aggressive in terms of adding food scraps to a system when it gets hot, because I know the system is going to overheat and the temperature outside is pretty warm too. So I don't have anything to compensate. Again, and then that's pretty much it. So I added some worms to this side, but I'm not worried about this side overheating because they will eventually migrate to this if it gets too hot. So next we'll just put a lid and let it do its thing. And we'll come back and check in a couple of weeks.